Hi, thanks for joining me, and I hope a lot of other people for the fall 2025 Bible study from Gather Magazine. I'm Christa von Zychlin, and I'm a Lutheran pastor of many decades, and I'm the writer of this three-part Bible study on money, stewardship, and generosity. Money. What do we most deeply treasure? The Bible refers to money, that is gold, silver, jewels, coins, and wealth, over 2,000 times. Jesus refers to money and treasure more often than he does to either heaven or hell. It makes sense, or should we say sense? Even though I just heard the US is no longer going to be manufacturing pennies as of early 2026. So we're going to have to try and rethink some of those sayings, like a nickel for your thoughts, perhaps. Sorry, that's really off topic. But it makes sense that Jesus talked about money and wealth and treasure because he lived in a material world where money plays a huge role in our wants and our needs. The gross unfairnesses and abuse of financial power in the world, and the joy of money, too. The scriptures invite us to be honest about having enough is a great blessing. Finding a lost coin or a bit of jewelry, enjoying the generosity of a fabulously rich person's deluxe banquet table is a vision of heaven. And also, here's the thing, all of us tend to make of money a god, right? Martin Luther, in the Large Catechism, when he leads us through the 10 Commandments, reminds us that the first commandment is you are to have no other gods, and asks, what does it mean to have another God? And the answer is, a God is that to which we are to look for all good, and in which we are to find refuge in all need. Also, a God is anything on which your heart relies and depends. And then he talks about those who have a god named Mammon, that is money and property. And Martin Luther says this is the most common idol on earth. Our focus Bible passage for this study on money is this from Matthew chapter 6, in part of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, for where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That's Jesus challenging us to be honest and to set our hearts, for liberating us to set our hearts on the true treasure, not to the corruptible treasure. So in this first study on money specifically, we will travel from Genesis, the very first book in the Bible, where the rivers of Eden in Eden, that garden of delight, where the rivers flow down banks studded with gold and jewels for the taking. We'll also look at the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, where the very streets of Jerusalem are paved with transparent gold. I'm sure that's meant metaphorically and imaginatively. And in the study, I mention imagining myself ice skating along those streets of transparent gold. Maybe we would call that gold skating. But again, that's metaphorically and imaginatively. But in between those bookend stories of abundance and beauty, we'll also notice the first time wealth is mentioned in the Bible, it's about the friction wealth and many possessions causes. Here, I'll read this to you from Genesis 13:2. This kind of sets the scene of how money works all too often, where we see Abraham had become very wealthy in livestock and silver and gold, and Lot, who was moving around with Abraham, also had flocks and herds and tents, but the land could not support them when they stayed together, for their possessions were so great, and quarreling arose. I think that's meant to be a bit of an entertaining story, just like today's reality shows or series like Succession show all the problems fabulously wealthy families tend to have. Maybe it's also no accident that the very first time the word money is used in the Bible, it's in the transactional sense of using money and silver to buy something in the context of slavery. We always overlook this story because it's part of of the story of the great covenant that God makes with Abram and Sarai when God says, circumcision is going to be the sign of this covenant that will mark you on your very own body, Abram. Well, there's something I've never noticed before, and maybe you haven't either. And that's how God is clear to say, and this covenant is for you and for the human being that you have thought to purchase with your silver. He too should be circumcised, because the covenant with God Almighty is for him too. And whereas the earliest audience for this story may have wrongly accepted slavery as just a part of life, today these same scriptures challenge us to diagnose something has gone horrifically wrong when humans created in the image of God are enslaved with an exchange of cash. Could there be a sliver of resistance that is embedded in this, what sometimes seems like a creaky old story? Even the human purchased for money has as much worth before God as Abraham. Human beings belong to God, and human life should never be reduced to a price. You'll also read from the prophet Amos in the Old Testament and from the mentoring letter of 1 Timothy in the New Testament about the dangers of the love of money. It's not money that's the root of all evil, but the love of money. You may also take some time to study the connection, sometimes disconnection, between wealth and wisdom. And why is it that we think if someone is rich, oh, they must have special knowledge and expertise that a poorer person doesn't? You'll maybe share with others in your small group about how you learned about money and wealth in childhood. I'm just working on a book about Mary, and I love to think about what Jesus may have learned from his parents about finances. What did Jesus learn from his dad about running the business of a carpentry workshop? What did Jesus learn from his mom, Mary? Probably she told him about that time that they, Mary, Jesus, and Joseph, were refugees in Egypt, probably poor as any refugee today, and how precious those bits of silver that they may or may not have been able to carry with them would have been. Money is precious, and yet, Jesus says, watch where you lay your heart. Watch to whom or to what you entrust yourself. And it's not things, it's not money that will buy you or me eternity. I do suggest that you end your time of study by reading or maybe praying together with others those old words of the 23rd Psalm, which reminds us in whom our hearts actually can trust. Enjoy the study. And and since we're Christians and since we're talking about money, I propose perhaps you and your study group might consider choosing an optional special offering that you can give joyfully to each month as part of each of these 3 sessions. You might choose something like Katie's Fund or ELCA World Hunger or a Lutheran or a other kind of local charity that you or your congregation has a relationship with, just for the joy of it and the practice of letting go a little bit. In any case, enjoy the Bible study, enjoy each other as you discuss, and may God use this time together to bless you and your congregation. Bye for now, and see you next month.